Week 11. The Last Bargain. County Clare, Ireland, mid-June 1847. The harvest came and it belonged to someone else. Patrick had imagined this day many times. In those dreams he had stood proudly in his field. He had cut the corn with his own hands. He had gathered it. He had stored enough away to see his family through the winter. Perhaps next year would be different. Perhaps the land would recover. Perhaps his children would grow strong again. But dreams had become dangerous things. They made reality harder to endure. The morning the harvest began, Patrick stood at the edge of the field holding his sickle. The crop was beautiful. That was the cruelest part. After everything, after the failed potatoes, after the hunger, after the deaths, after watching his children grow thin and weak, the land had produced. It had done exactly what it was supposed to do, only not for them. Patrick looked across the rows of golden grain. For a moment he thought of taking some, not stealing, not really, just enough. A few sacks, enough for Mary, enough for Eileen, enough to put strength back into their bodies, enough to keep them alive until next spring. Then he remembered the ledger, the measurements, the missing portion already recorded. Another shortage would destroy them completely, so he lowered the sickle and began cutting. It took most of the day, then the next. Patrick worked alongside several other hired men. Nobody spoke much. Everybody knew where the grain was going. Everybody knew who had grown it. Everybody knew who would eat it. The barrows carried the harvest away from Patrick's field. Each load felt like something being taken from him. Not just grain, not just food, a future. Eileen watched from the cottage doorway. She watched every cart leave, every barrow disappear down the road. The children stood beside her. Mary looked older than 14, much older. She had stopped asking when Bridget would return. The question had become too painful. Patrick had stopped promising she would. Promises had become another thing they could no longer afford. At the holding shed near the landlord's house, the grain was counted, measured, recorded. Mr. Pemberton stood with his ledger open. One of his assistants marked each delivery. Another checked the weight. Patrick watched every number, every mark, every entry. Finally, as the last barrow was emptied, Pemberton closed his book. The amount received corresponds with the expected harvest. Patrick stared at him. What? Pemberton looked up. There is a deficiency. Patrick's heart sank. How much? The agent checked his notes. Approximately the amount lost through the theft. Patrick let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. So? He hesitated. The stolen grain is all that's missing. Yes. Patrick nodded slowly. For a brief moment, something almost like relief passed over him. He had delivered everything, every stalk, every ear, everything that remained. He had done his duty, and then the reality struck him. The landlord would receive exactly what he was owed. The theft had been accounted for. The rent had been protected. But Patrick had nothing. Nothing. He looked at the great piles of grain stored inside the shed, enough to feed his family for months, enough to save them, and not a single handful belonged to him. His voice came quietly. Mr. Pemberton? The agent looked up. Patrick struggled. The words wouldn't come. He had rehearsed them for weeks. He was supposed to ask. He was supposed to explain. He was supposed to appeal to whatever humanity remained, but now he couldn't. The ledger was complete. The delivery was complete. The agreement had been fulfilled. What right did he have to ask? What could he offer? He had no money, no strength, no bargaining position, only hunger. Pemberton seemed to understand. You needn't ask. Patrick looked at him. Need not? The agent looked uncomfortable. The harvest belongs to the landlord. Patrick nodded. Of course. He already knew. I understand. And he did. That was the worst part. The walk home felt longer than any journey Patrick had ever taken. His hands were empty. His pockets were empty. Behind him the landlord's grain remained safely stored. Ahead of him was a cottage with no food inside. No grain, no potatoes, no animals, no money, no plan. He had spent months fighting to preserve a future that no longer existed, and now the future had arrived. It was empty. Halfway home he stopped. The road blurred. His chest tightened. He coughed, once, twice. Then violently. He bent over, unable to breathe, and the coughing continued until his entire body shook. He tasted blood. He tried to straighten and failed. The ground rushed towards him. Patrick Dunne collapsed beside the road. It was nearly an hour later when Mary saw him. She'd been watching from the cottage window, and at first she thought he had stopped to rest. Then she saw he wasn't moving. Da! She ran. Eileen followed as quickly as her weakened body allowed. Together they reached him. Patrick was conscious, but barely. "I'm all right." The words were automatic. Mary almost cried out. "No, you're not." Patrick tried to stand. His legs failed. Between them, they helped him rise. There was no weight to carry, and that was the frightening thing. Patrick had become so thin that Mary and Eileen could move him without difficulty. But they had so little strength themselves that even the small effort exhausted them. Inside the cottage, they laid him upon the straw mattress. Eileen placed her hand against his face. Her expression changed immediately. "He's burning." Patrick closed his eyes. "I'm fine." "No." She looked at Mary and spoke urgently. "Go to the stream. Bring water, as much as you can carry." Mary nodded. "Now." Mary and young Brian, who was visiting from the neighbours down the road, both hurried away. Ellen soaked a cloth and pressed it against Patrick's forehead, and his eyes opened weakly. "I'm sorry." The words frightened her more than the fever. "Don't." "Don't say it. I should have found a way." She leaned close. "You've done nothing but find ways." He looked toward the empty room. "I failed." "No. I couldn't save Michael. Patrick, I couldn't find Bridget." Tears filled his eyes. "I couldn't even feed you." Eileen placed both hands over his. "You're here, for now." The words chilled her. That evening, after Patrick finally fell asleep, Eileen sat beside him. She watched his breathing. The fever had not broken. The cough had worsened. She knew. She had known it for some time. Patrick might not survive the summer. If he didn't, what would happen to her? To Mary? 2 starving women alone, a cottage they couldn't keep, a rent they couldn't pay, a world that had already taken 2 children from them. The thought returned, the one she had fought for weeks, the one she had hated herself for considering. She looked at Patrick. She looked at Mary sleeping against the wall. Brian on the other side, also asleep. She thought of Michael, of Seamus, of Bridget walking alone somewhere beyond their reach. She thought of the landlord's grain. She thought of Mr. Pemberton, and she understood something with terrible clarity. There was no food coming, no miracle, no rescue, no prayer, only choices, and every choice carried a price. Before dawn, Eileen stood. She dressed quietly. She wrapped a plain cloth around her shoulders, not a shawl. There was no shawl anymore. She looked once at Patrick, then at Mary, then at Brian. Her hand trembled as she opened the door. The road ahead led toward the house where William Pemberton lived, the landlord's man, the man who could decide whether they remained on their land, the man who had access to the grain, the man she had sworn she would never approach. Eileen walked slowly. Each step felt like a betrayal, of Patrick, of herself, of everything she had once believed. By the time she reached the gate, she was crying, not because she was afraid of what might happen, but because she already knew what she was prepared to offer. And she hated the world that forced the thought into her mind. She raised her hand towards the door and knocked. Week 12, The Last Road. County Clare, Ireland, late June 1847. The door closed behind Eileen. For several moments she remained standing outside the house of William Pemberton. She had imagined this moment many times. She had imagined shame. She had imagined anger. She had imagined him looking at her with contempt. She had imagined herself unable to speak. She had not imagined feeling nothing. But that's what came first. Nothing. A terrible emptiness. She had barely managed the words. At first, Pemberton had not understood. Or perhaps he had understood immediately and simply refused to acknowledge it. Eileen. She had hated hearing her name spoken by him, not because of the man, because of what she had come to ask. "I need help." He had looked away. "You know our situation." "I know you've suffered. Our crop is gone." "Yes, my husband is sick." "I heard." "My children—" Her voice broke. She forced herself to continue. "I need enough grain to keep them alive." Her voice broke. She forced herself to continue. "I need enough grain to keep them alive." Pemberton had been silent. Then she had said the words she could barely force from her mouth, words that had burnt her throat, words she would carry for the rest of her life. "I will do whatever is required." She had not needed to explain. He understood. And that understanding had been the worst part. For a long moment he had simply looked at her, not with cruelty, not with desire, with sadness. That almost made it worse. "Eileen," she looked down, "I cannot." The words struck harder than anger would have. "You cannot?" "No." "The grain?" "No." The food? No. She finally looked up. Why? Pemberton's face tightened. Because whatever you're offering, he paused, it would not change what I am. She stared at him. I don't understand. I'm still the landlord's agent. He looked towards the field beyond the house. I cannot give away what is not mine. A bitter laugh escaped her. Not yours. No, not mine either. No. Then whose? He had no answer, and that answer told her everything. She walked home slowly, not because she was tired, because she had nowhere left to hurry towards. The world had narrowed. There was the road, the cottage, Patrick, Mary, nothing else. When she opened the door, she knew immediately something had changed. The fever had worsened. Patrick's breathing was shallow. Her face was flushed. Her skin burned beneath her hand. Patrick. His eyes opened weakly. You're back. She forced a smile. I am. Did you? He couldn't finish. She sat beside him. No. He closed his eyes. For a moment neither spoke. Then Patrick whispered, I'm sorry. She shook her head. No more apologies. There was no anger in her voice, only exhaustion. The night passed slowly. Eileen did everything she could. Cold cloths, water, whispered encouragement. Every hour she hoped the fever would break. Every hour it remained. At some point she realized she had stopped praying, not because she no longer wanted to, but because she no longer knew who was listening. By morning Patrick was worse. His fever had climbed higher. His breathing sounded heavier. Eileen looked around the cottage. There was no medicine, no money, no doctor. Even if she had somehow found coins, there was nobody left to call. The last doctor she had known in Kilrush had boarded a ship months before. America. Another one gone. Another empty place left behind. The famine had not only taken food, it had taken people. Mary woke to find her mother sitting beside Patrick. He's worse. She didn't need to ask. She could see. The hunger had hollowed everyone. The fear had aged everyone. But Patrick lying there looking more fragile than any of them. Ma'am. Eileen turned. There's nothing here. Mary looked towards the empty shelves. Nothing. No meal. No bread. No potatoes. Nothing. I need you and your father to eat something. Mary shook her head. We can wait. No. Eileen spoke firmly. The Kilrush Workhouse has a soup kitchen. Mary stiffened. The workhouse. Everyone knew what that meant. But everyone also knew what hunger meant. Go. But you, I'll stay with Da. Mary looked towards Patrick, then nodded, as she and Brian disappeared down the road towards the workhouse. The walk to Kilrush was slow. Mary and the younger children who were no longer there would have rushed along this road, but now she and Brian walked carefully, saving energy, saving breath. At the workhouse soup kitchen the line was long. Faces surrounded her, thousands of faces like hers. Thin, tired, waiting. Nobody spoke much. There was no need. Everyone knew why they were there. When Mary finally received the bowl of soup, she held it carefully, not because it was much, but because it was something. Something warm, something inside her body, something that meant one more day. When she and Brian returned, the cottage was quiet. Too quiet. Ma! No answer. She stepped inside and stopped. Eileen was sitting beside Patrick, but she wasn't alone. At least, she didn't believe she was. There you are, Michael. Mary froze. Her mother smiled warmly. I told you not to run in the mud. Silence. Then, Seamus, come here. Mary's heart broke. Ma'am. Eileen looked up. Oh, Mary. She smiled. Your brothers are here. Mary looked around the room. There was nobody. Just herself and Brian, still standing in the doorway. No, ma'am. They came back. Eileen reached out towards empty air. Look how tall Michael has gotten. Mary began crying. Ma'am. And Bridget. Eileen laughed softly. She's still hiding. She turned toward the corner. Come out, darling. Mary covered her mouth. She understood. The hunger, the grief, the exhaustion. Everything had finally become too much. Her mother was somewhere else now, somewhere with all her children, a place where they were alive. Patrick opened his eyes weakly. Mary? She rushed to him. Da. Your mother. Mary looked over. Eileen was still speaking softly to the empty room. Patrick closed his eyes. He understood. And somehow that hurt more than anything else. There was no discussion, no argument, no dramatic decision, only the quiet understanding of two children who had run out of choices. Mary looked at Brian and then looked at the small cottage, place where she had been born, where Michael had laughed, where Bridget had played, where Seamus had taken his first steps. It was no longer a home, it was a place where memories lived. The living had nowhere left to go. The barrows were still outside, 2 old wooden carts once used for carrying turf and stones. Mary looked at them, then at her father, then at her mother. She understood what had to happen. "Help me," she said to Brian. Her voice shook, but she didn't hesitate. They placed Patrick in one barrow. He was barely conscious, too weak to protest. Eileen in the other. She smiled as Mary approached. "There you are, Seamus." Mary swallowed her tears. "Yes, ma'am." She didn't correct her, not any more. The road to Kilrush was not far, but it had never seemed longer. Mary pushed one barrow, Brian pulled the other. Every few steps they had to stop, not because the weight was too great, but because they were both too weak. Her father opened his eyes once. "I'm sorry." Mary stopped. "No." "I couldn't. No." She gripped the handles. "You brought us this far." People watched them pass. Some recognized the family, some looked away. Not from cruelty, from shame. Everyone knew this could be them. The famine had turned entire communities into witnesses to suffering they could not prevent. By late afternoon they reached the gates of the Kilrush Workhouse. The building stood before them, cold, imposing, terrifying, but inside there was food, there was shelter, there were walls, there was a chance. Mary looked at the door, and for a moment she thought of turning away. Then she looked at her parents, but there was nowhere else. She lifted her hand, knocked, and after several moments the door opened. A workhouse attendant looked down. 2 children, 2 broken parents, 2 empty barrows. The attendant's expression softened. "Name?" Mary swallowed. "Dunne." She looked back at the road behind them, the farm, the field, the cottage, everything they had lost. "My name is Mary Dunne." The attendant looked towards the 2 adults. "And these?" She hesitated, then answered, "My father, my mother." The words almost broke her. "We need to be admitted." The attendant stepped aside, and for a moment Mary didn't move. Behind that door was not home. It was not freedom. It was not the life her parents had dreamed of, but it was life. And after everything the famine had taken, life was enough. The 2 children pushed the barrows forward into the workhouse. The door closed behind them. Outside, the road remained empty, the fields remained golden, the harvest continued. And somewhere beyond the Atlantic, ships continued to carry away those who had escaped. But for Patrick and Eileen Dunne, for Seamus, for Michael, for Bridget, and for all the families who walked that same final road, the famine had finally taken everything, except the will to survive.